Comments. Last very brief question. The honourable member for Ottawa Southwest.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This morning in Natural Resources Committee, Madam Speaker, we heard testimony about Yukon's Environmental and Socioeconomic Assessment Act. And it was very revealing to see how it was arrived at, supported by industry, environmental groups, labour groups, all kinds of players in Yukon society. It took 3 to 4 years to craft it. And it's just in complete contradistinction to what the government is doing here. I think the government could take a page and learn from the Yukon experience to come up with a better regulatory process, improve it, which we all want to see for Canadians, but do it in a way that's inclusive, meaningful, consultative. It ends up with a process that everybody believes in. Perhaps my colleague can respond to that.
The honourable member for York West, a 30-second response.
Well, I'd like to say that I think that's the way I think things are supposed to get done. In my 25 years in political life, when we've really had good success is when we've done exactly what my honourable colleague has suggested, and that you bring all of the affected people together and you design a plan, a program. That's how you move forward. That's the way you have true success, not just deciding in your back room, well, this is where we want to go. Because we don't have the money anyway, because they're starving the government for revenue at the rate they're going between the GST reductions and the other reductions. Government isn't going to have enough money to function, and that'll be their rationale as to why they have to do all these other cuts, because they don't have the money to do the oversight required.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Ottawa South.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have a question for my colleague, which I think would be helpful in our overall discussion about the process that's gone on here. I think it's fair to say there's a consensus in the House, I think even amongst some backbenchers in the government, that this bill should have been divided into pieces and that there should have been proper consideration given to the regulatory changes. For example, we know in the wake of this week's oil spill in Alberta that the Government of Canada's regulatory standards right now for pipelines do not distinguish between diluted bitumen and conventional oil. We know that diluted bitumen is more problematic to ship, more toxic, more corrosive, more abrasive, and is more likely to lead to more pipeline ruptures, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if she can address how that kind of issue specifically would have benefited from a proper multi-stakeholder process, either through Canada's National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy, which was just killed, or perhaps even at a special legislative committee.
For Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member for his question. It's very complex, and I'll try to give a succinct response. The example that the honourable member is raising, though, is a really important one to give us a context for looking at this bill, C-38. One of the strongest reasons for maintaining a strong Federal Fisheries Act and a strong Canadian Environmental Assessment Act is to make sure that we have thorough reviews of major projects that may actually impact the environment or human health. And given the recent incidents that have occurred in a 2-week period, we've had 2 breaks in pipelines in my province of Alberta, not detected by the pipeline owner or operator, not detected by either federal or provincial officers, but detected by First Nation peoples or by farmers. We should have a proper review of this legislation, this critical federal legislation, if we're planning to change it. And we should revert to the very thorough, robust processes that were in place before this government took the reins of power.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Ottawa South.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd just like to pick up on something the member raised during his remarks, and that was he cited the case of the Yukon. The Yukon has its own environmental assessment process agreed with the federal government. It took several years to develop. And the good news about the Yukon process is that when it was being developed, there was extensive consultation with industry, with the labour movement, with environmental NGOs who were not described as radical or accused of laundering money, with different groups, working with the government. And when the final process was brought into play in the Yukon, everyone signed off on it. Everyone agreed with it, Mr. Speaker. It's a very, very interesting model for us to be learning from. Why didn't the government actually follow the good advice and the good system that was put in place under the previous Liberal government to actually arrive at a system which, in fact, improved the system, but everybody agreed with the actual changes?
Member for Dauphin, Swan River, Mark.
I thank my honourable friend for his question, and I must say I do respect his own career record in environmental policy making. It was long and distinguished. In terms of the Yukon, it is a model act, and it was a good piece of legislation. But I would remind my friend and others opposite that I do sit on the Environment Committee, and we had an extensive review of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, and we heard much testimony about the failures of that current act and how it could be made better. So that testimony from a wide variety of individuals and groups across the country certainly informed the decisions that we finally made as a government.
The honourable member the honourable member for Ottawa South.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I'd just like to pick up on the comments made by the Parliamentary Secretary for Defence. I'd like to remind the Parliamentary Secretary and put a question to my colleague at the same time. The more I hear the Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister speak, the more I'm reminded of my great-grandparents who used to work for a very well-established old lumber baron from the Ottawa Valley. And it sounds like this government is pursuing a 19th century strategy of hewing wood and drawing water. What this country needs, what this budget should be reflecting, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to put this to my colleague, is we don't have an innovation strategy. Our venture capital money is fleeing the country. There's an energy efficiency race on around the world. We haven't even got sneakers on yet. And finally, Professor Porter from Harvard tells us that this better environmental performance is absolutely consistent with enhanced competitiveness. The changes that are being brought in this budget will actually erode those standards and erode our competitiveness. Perhaps my colleague will comment on that.
Member for Scarborough Southwest.
I would absolutely love to, and the analogy of going back to a 19th century economy is apt. In 1999, Canada exported, among all of its exports, 60% were of finished products. In just the last decade, we've gone from exporting 60% finished products to only exporting 33% finished products. The other 66% is now unfinished or partially processed products. So absolutely, we are hindering the value-added sections of our economy with this unbalanced approach that the Conservative government is taking. And it's absolutely the wrong way to go. With respect to innovation, we are looking at the Jenkins report, and nothing as of yet is being implemented. We now have massive changes to the Investment Canada Act, where now 3 times the previous limit is now going to be what's subject to review. All of those incubator companies and industries, those real innovators and productive companies, are now going to get gobbled up by large foreign companies, and we're going to lose the benefits from them. Thank you.
Ottawa South.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to pick up on my colleague's comments and just recap for a second. Let's just see where we've come from. In 1995, Canada balanced its budget. For 10 years, we had 10 consecutive years of surpluses. In 2006, the Conservative government's elected with a $13 billion surplus. Even before the recession hit, Madam Speaker, which the government denied, the government increased spending by 19%, the single largest increase in spending in Canadian history, making it the biggest spending, biggest borrowing government in Canadian history. The Minister of Finance rejected a bailout of the car industry and had to because a pistol was to his head by the Premier of Ontario and the President of the United States. The record now is we see 2 sets of books on the F-35. The PBO can't get numbers to actually disclose the facts. Certainly we've had the biggest billboards in Canadian history, $30 million on 9,000 billboards across the country to advertise a budget. Now we're left with a $128 billion increase in debt. It's the same old, Madam Speaker. These Republican reformers are the same. They cut taxes, they increase spending, they borrow the money, and they compromise public services.
Very brief last question. The honourable member for Ottawa Southwest.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. A quick question, if I could, to my colleague through you. I'd like to ask her about the international trend towards energy efficiency. We know now for decades, we've known for decades, that better environmental performance, both in a company and in a nation state, is absolutely consistent with enhanced competitiveness for that company and the country involved. Can she help us understand how important it is for Canada to get into the energy efficiency race, to be able to compete properly.
The honourable member for Etobicoke North, and there's 30 seconds left.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague for such an important question. Canada's missed opportunities. When we had the economic stimulus, it could have been a green stimulus. Canada invested $3 billion. The United States invested $112 billion. China invested $221 billion. Who gets the jobs? It wasn't Canada. We need a green economy strategy. We need a national sustainable energy strategy, and the energy efficiency has to be part of it. Business understands when you reduce your inputs, you reduce your waste, you save on the bottom line.
Comments? Last very brief question, the honourable member for Ottawa Southwest.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This morning in Natural Resources Committee, Madam Speaker, we heard testimony about the Yukon's Environmental and Socioeconomic Assessment Act. And it was very revealing to see how it was arrived at, supported by industry, environmental groups, labour groups, all kinds of players in Yukon society. It took 3 to 4 years to craft it, and it's just in complete contradistinction to what the government is doing here. I think the government could take a page and learn from the Yukon experience to come up with a better regulatory process, and improve it, which we all want to see for Canadians, but do it in a way that's inclusive, meaningful, consultative. It ends up with a process that everybody believes in. Perhaps my colleague can respond to that.
The honourable member for York West, a 30-second response.
Well, I'd like to say that I think that's the way I think things are supposed to get done. In my 25 years in political life, when we've really had good success is when we've done exactly what my honourable colleague has suggested, and that you bring all of the affected people together and you design a plan, a program. That's how you move forward. That's the way you have true success, not just deciding in your back room, well, this is where we want to go. Because we don't have the money anyway, because they're starving the government for revenue at the rate they're going between the GST reductions and the other reductions. Government isn't going to have enough money to function, and that'll be their rationale as to why they have to do all these other cuts, because they don't have the money to do the oversight required.
The honourable member for Ottawa South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to begin on a general note for Canadians who might be watching or those who are following this debate to try and perhaps slow down the pace of the detail that's being presented here on all sides of the House and remind Canadians what's at stake here. What are we talking about here this evening? Why have so many amendments been presented, and will be subject to voting very shortly? Why is all this kerfuffle happening about this budget bill, Mr. Speaker? First of all, for everyday Canadians who are busy leading just-in-time lives, trying to raise their kids, pay their mortgages, pay their rent, look after a loved one, this is very complicated. But there are some simple facts, I think, that are worthy of communication for them this evening. First of all, this is a budget document that's 425 pages in length. It's got 753 clauses. It's changing or doing away with 70 different laws that exist today in Canada. Here are a few of the things it does in unprecedented fashion, because it's not an economic document, and it's certainly not an economic transformative plan, as the Minister would have us believe. First of all, it rewrites Canada's environmental laws. 40 years in the making, in this bill, in this draft budget, gone. It breaks the Conservative government's election promise by raising the age of old age supplement from 65 to 67. Does any Canadian remember hearing that in the last election campaign? Nope. Did the government run on that platform?
Nope.
It creates uncertainty for our seasonal industries with changes to employment insurance, something I'll come back to momentarily. It hurts Canada's international brand by tearing up 100,000 immigration applications with a stroke of a pen. 100,000 human beings waiting for their immigration applications to be processed, now out of luck. It imposes the Conservatives' unilateral decision to reduce health care transfers payments to the provinces and territories. Did they run on that platform? Nope. Did they consult or did they negotiate with the provinces? No. They are now targeting, through this bill, charities that they disagree with. Did they run on that in their platform? They eliminated groups such as the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy, Rights and Democracy, and the National Council on Welfare. All groups the Conservatives disagree with. Did they run on those promises, Mr. Speaker? No. It's reducing the Auditor General's oversight on a number of government agencies. How can that be a good thing? Including the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and the Northern Pipeline Agency. It's reducing democratic oversight of our spy agency, CSIS, by abolishing the Office of the Inspector General. It repeals the Kyoto Protocol Implementation Act. It eliminates a number of the government's reporting requirements on climate change and public service jobs. And it makes changes that every expert who's come forward and testified, they've warned changes to the parole hearings are unconstitutional. So in short, Mr. Speaker, it's anti-democratic. They're using a single omnibus budget bill to limit debate and ram through these unrelated measures through Parliament. That's what this debate is about for Canadians who are watching. But it's no surprise for those of us who lived through the Ontario first incarnation of the Republican government, which has ended up here, because the technique that was perfected in Ontario to create omnibus budget bills and omnibus bills began under former Premier Mike Harris, perfected by our present-day Minister of Finance. But let's focus on the old age supplement as an important issue for a moment. They're breaking their election promise, as I said, by raising the age for OAS from 65 to 67. They're ignoring the advice of the OECD, Canada's Chief Actuarial Officer, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and even the government's own experts, who have all agreed and all testified the change is not necessary because our OAS program is already sustainable. This will really hurt, Mr. Speaker, particularly rural Canadians and single women who disproportionately depend on OAS and GIS. It also hurts our physical labourers who cannot continue working. 40% of our OAS recipients earn less than $20,000 a year, and more than half earn less than $25,000 a year. In my riding of Ottawa South, it's no different. This change is going to hurt Canada's most vulnerable seniors the hardest. That's just not right, Mr. Speaker, when our seniors, who have invested so much in our country, need our support now more than ever. Let's turn to the changes under employment insurance. What have we heard? We did not hear how these changes will help solve skilled labour shortages. We did not hear how many of the current 250,000 job openings are going to be filled because of these changes. We did not hear how these changes will assist 1.4 million Canadians out of work. We didn't hear that Canadians have been consulted about these changes. We did not hear how they'll help communities and workers who only have seasonal industries, and how that will help them foster more full-time industries. What happened here is these changes really brand those who require EI, Mr. Speaker, during recurring periods of no-fault job loss as, in their language, repeat offenders. Imagine, if you're on EI in Canada, you're a repeat offender. You better watch out. And it forces them to take a 30% pay cut in a lower skilled job outside their area of training. Cheap labor. It forces people to take jobs further away from home, thereby incurring higher costs for a low-skilled job that pays less. Boy, that makes sense, Mr. Speaker, in the 21st century. So it's policy created on the fly. They didn't have a plan. They didn't have a rationale for the changes. No information, no facts, no analysis. Just a belief that EI claimants are lazy, they're abusing the system, and they desire to penalize seasonal workers in industries. It's reminiscent, Mr. Speaker, of the member from Ottawa West Nepean's press conference in Ontario several years ago when, as a minister in the Harris regime, he took a box of syringes, dumped them onto the floor in front of the cameras, and went on to explain that the reason why the government was pushing workfare so hard was because all welfare recipients in Ontario were shooting their checks up their arms. That's the kind of character at play here, Mr. Speaker, character that's still there. But if you don't take my word for it, Mr. Speaker, Let's listen to what the media have to say about this budget. The Globe and Mail. The budget bill contains too much for adequate consideration by Parliament. It's a steamroller of sweeping change, from the streamlining of environmental regulations to the reform of old age security and EI. This is anti-democratic, says the Halifax Chronicle Herald. It's a monster budget bill introduced last week in an omnibus bill on steroids, says the Halifax Chronicle Herald. It's also nonsense, they go on to say, to pretend one debate, one committee review, and one vote will allow Parliament to competently examine this legal spaghetti. The Toronto Star. This reeks of hypocrisy. The Toronto Star again. This is political sleight of hand and message control. And it appears to be an accelerating trend. These shabby tactics keep Parliament and Canadians in the dark, swamp MPs with so much legislation that they can't absorb it, and hobble scrutiny. This is not good, accountable, transparent government. It is not what the Prime Minister promised to deliver. And they go on. If more Canadians understood it, they would be horrified by the lack of time allotted to its consideration. The Montreal Gazette. The Winnipeg Free Press. Under the Conservatives, parliamentary committees, like Parliament itself, are mere toys of the party in power. Routinely gagged the moment an opposition MP moves a motion. We've certainly seen that behaviour, Mr. Speaker. The Ottawa Citizen. A simple question. What's the rush? And it goes on and on. The National Post. As you remove the outer layers of the bill, you discover potentially far-reaching policy shifts that have no business being in any budget, far less being scrutinised by the Finance Committee, the National Post. And perhaps to close, Mr. Speaker, my favourite, published just some hours ago at 6:20 p.m. this afternoon from Post Media. Their primary justification for the omnibus bill, that all its measures together form an integrated, coherent vision and plan of economic transformation, is demonstrably nonsense. How can reforms to the Parks Canada Agencies Act, the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, and the elimination of the Office of the Inspector General for the Canadian Security Intelligence Service possibly be interpreted as economic? And they go on to conclude by asking this question. Why bother wasting time with the bothersome business of committee review and public debate? It would be far more efficient, says Post Media, certainly cheaper, for the Prime Minister to rule by decree. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. Kisses and commentary. The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Ottawa South for a very comprehensive and important speech. I am unhappy with the fact that this bill is continually described as though it will do great things for jobs in the economy, and we have failed as parliamentarians to examine the ways in which Bill C-38 is a threat to jobs in our economy. I'm taken by the fact that many Conservative members have spoken tonight about the importance of competitiveness, research and development, innovation, and yet all the best studies in the world on competitiveness, and I mentioned, for example, Michael Porter at Harvard University, have said that when you reduce the rigor of your environmental regulations, you make yourself less competitive and have fewer innovations. And this is the one area where Canada is really lagging, is R&D and innovation. I wonder if my honourable friend would comment on whether he agrees with me that this budget, so-called budget implementation bill, is actually will undermine Canada's competitiveness and reduce our ability to come up with the research and innovation to stay ahead.
The Honourable Member for Ottawa South.
Well, I thank my colleague tremendously for that question. It is spot on, Mr. Speaker. Spot on. In the 21st century, we shouldn't be racing to compete with jurisdictions who can dig up minerals, who can cut forests, who can harvest fish, who can move into the natural resources industry that Canada used to excel at in the early 20th century. This is not Canada's role for the future. Where is the investment in venture capital? Why are we discussing new startups for Canada? Why is the Sustainable Development Technology Foundation being robbed of capital to capitalize and partner with our private sector to give rise to new green technologies? Mr. Speaker, the race is on for energy efficiency all over the planet. Every jurisdiction knows this. Canada should be leading this race, but unfortunately, I don't think the Prime Minister has a pair of running shoes.
Questions and comments. Kisses and commentary. The honourable member for Vancouver East.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to say to the honourable member, I thought he made a very good speech. It covered a lot of points about this terrible budget bill, and I don't know about his community, but I know in my community there's a growing sense that this budget bill creates an even bigger and bigger divide in our country. It increases the gap of inequality. And I've been focusing some of my remarks tonight about housing, because this bill does not mention housing anywhere. We have a housing crisis, whether it's in Ottawa, whether it's in Toronto, Vancouver. Many communities are facing this housing crisis. So I'd like to ask the member if he could reflect on that and whether or not he too is dealing with some of the critical issues around affordable housing here in the City of Ottawa.
The honourable member for Ottawa South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to my colleague. Yes, we are right here in this jurisdiction, in the shadow of the Peace Tower. There's a desperate need for housing. It's interesting to reflect back. One of the first acts of this government, upon taking minority government, was to do away with our housing department. It was to do away with it with one stroke of a pen. And now, where are we? Is there a national housing strategy? Are we dealing with some of the homelessness crises? Are we connecting the dots between homelessness and mental health issues and challenges? Are we connecting the dot with substance abuse? The dots? No, we're not. This is a step back for Canada. This is a focus on harvesting the low-hanging fruit of natural resources as quickly as we can, to sell as much fossil fuel as we can, to sell as much mineral as we can. We're not opposed to those extractive industries, don't get me wrong, but it's a race to sell as much as we can, to make as much money as we can, in my estimation, Mr. Speaker, so the Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister can stand up in 3 years' time and say, Canadians, we know we've undermined your 21st century economy, but have we got a tax cut for you?